I want to really follow on from what James has said. I mean, he's given a picture of this economic crisis, which is the most severe economic crisis since the 1930s. And of course, the 1930s, for anybody, I don't think any of us here can remember it, but for anybody who's read their history, knows that that was a period where not just was the great misery around the world, but there was also great rebellion around the world, and there was a real contest in the world between whether the world would become a more equal place, or whether, as did eventually happen, and certainly in parts, that fascism would grow. Now, we're not at a serious crisis yet as then, but we are at a serious crisis, and we are at a serious crisis which, as James has said, is challenging certainly things that all of us were really brought up to believe were going to be things that we've come to expect, and that our future generations, our children, our grandchildren, would actually be able to get even better. I mean, we now have this coalition government, this whatever you want to call it, the condemned government, or whatever name you give to it, a government which has very little legitimacy, in my opinion. That people certainly didn't vote for the Lib Dems on the basis that they thought they were going to go into alliance with the Tories. In fact, there was a poll done on Newsnight last night which said that 40% of people who voted Lib Dem wouldn't do so again, or wouldn't have done so then if they thought they were going to go into alliance with the Tories. I don't know what the other 58% were doing, because most people who vote Lib Dem really aren't people who are Tories. They're either people who are in kind of Tory areas who don't like the Tories, or they're people who are fed up with what Labour has done over 13 years. And of course, one of the problems that we have as a left today is that for many, many years, certainly in the period after the Second World War, and for a long, long time in the 50s and 60s, people thought Labour would deliver things. We've now lived through 13 years of Labour government, and it's quite incredible what the result has been. The inequality has grown. The City of London has been able to do exactly what James described, with absolutely no control over it. This man Hayward from BP is walking off today, well, what is it, £1 million payout and £600,000 a year pension. Now, when you think people around here are living on £100 a week pension, you know, this kid who probably would have struggled to have earned that much money in a lifetime, let alone over a period of, get that as a pension for 1 year, and nobody says anything about this, nobody thinks is anything but what he deserves, even though he was responsible for, or at least in charge of BP when they had this terrible oil leak where 11 people died, and his response to that was, well, I need to get my life back. I mean, these are the kind of people, unlike the 11 people who weren't going to get their lives back, you know, these are the kind of people you're dealing with. And Labour, I mean, we now have it in Peter Mandelson's diaries, his memoirs of the Blair-Brown years. Labour really was not concerned with the big questions of how to get down inequality, of how to get children out of poverty, of how to deal with wars or climate change, all these things. They were concerned with, you know, whether Gordon Brown had been snubbed by Tony Blair, who was going to get the biggest package when they left government, who was going to go to the House of Lords. These are the kind of questions that obsess these people. And I think that when you look now at what is happening, what the Tories and the Lib Dems are really building on is what Labour has allowed them to build on, which is why Labour are more obsessed now over these summer months, not with fighting the government, which has just ran through an education bill using laws that have only previously been used for anti-terror laws. You know, in other words, they're emergency laws so that they can privatise the schools this September. They don't even want to leave it another year. They want to be able to do it this September so people can start taking lumps out of the education system. The attacks aren't just on, you know, when people talk about the cuts, I think it kind of underestimates really what is happening here, because there's been cuts in this country for what, 30, more than that actually, since 1976, when the last Labour government that most of us here can't remember, but in 1976 they first started cuts, and cuts have been part and parcel of local government, of education, of all these things now for decades and decades. But what they're talking about now is not just cuts, you know, in inverted commas, This is really an attack on the whole welfare state. I mean, all the things that you would have expected if you grew up, as I did, in the 1950s and the 1960s in this country, which was free education, a grant to go to college, no fees in education, a pension without having to pay into a private pension plan, a pension when you got too old to work any longer. And by the way, that used to be 60 for women, but now they're raising the pension age all the time. That you would expect that you would have a welfare state which would provide education free, which would provide health free, which would provide things like libraries and swimming pools and all the things that generally were regarded to make people's lives better. Now, all that is going. They are saying that everything, 20% of everything, and maybe more in certain areas, is really up for the chop. Now what that means is not just a bit of cuts and more people working harder because there's fewer jobs there. Somebody said to me today that Lambeth Council, which is a Labour council in South London, is losing 700 jobs as a result of these cuts. Now this is a huge attack, not just on the workers who will lose those jobs and therefore will be unemployed, but also a huge attack on the people who consume, if you want to call it in the jargon that they now talk about now, but people who consume those services, the people who need education or need healthcare or need social services or need any of these kind of things. And it does really quite beg a belief that we now have a time when they are saying that they simply cannot provide. Now, if you think what was built and what was provided in the 1940s and the 1950s and the 1960s, when Britain was a much poorer country than it is now, when capitalism was a much smaller system than it is now, when all those things should have been harder to provide, but actually they were easier to provide. And they were easier to provide because actually, as a result of what had happened in the 1930s and through the Second World War and the aftermath of the Second World War, people felt they had a right to a better living standard, and the system expanded enough in order to enable that to happen. That started to change in the mid-70s, and it has continued to change. And now James is absolutely right. They are now making a choice. Can we afford to bankroll the banks and provide a welfare state? And if we can't, it's absolutely no contest what the priority is. And everybody is told that they have to accept this because to do anything else would be unthinkable, it would be crazy, it would be utopian, it would be all the things that maybe all of us are probably guilty of, or certainly I am, because I do actually believe in a society that is one of the wealthiest in the world. We should be able to have equality. We should be able to have a house for everybody. We should be able to have decent education for everybody. These don't strike me as utopian demands. They strike me as demands that people have always fought for and will continue to fight for, and will have to fight very, very hard to maintain and retain these under this present government. And don't believe it would be any different under any other government. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the Lib Dems, the way they talked before they went into office and the way they talk now, is like night and day. It's suddenly, oh, we thought this was a good idea, but maybe it isn't such a good idea anymore. Maybe we can't afford it. Maybe we just have to sacrifice for a few years. But you know, people have been sacrificing now for a lot of years. They have been finding all these debts piling up on them. And debt is a form of, you know, it's a form of actually allowing people to have lower wages than they otherwise should have, and that what you do is borrow off the wages that you don't earn. That's what debt really means. And actually that's why in low-wage economies like the United States and Britain, debt is such a big part of workers' lives. So all of us, probably, nearly all of us, if we're lucky enough to have jobs or to have had jobs, we will all have debts probably up to our eyeballs, and probably it isn't getting any better. You know, that's a situation we find ourselves in. And it's also an interesting thing that, you know, if you look at what Karl Marx wrote about capitalism in the 19th century, and when he was writing, capitalism was only a tiny part of the world system. It was only in Britain and parts of Western Europe and North America and all those places. But Marx said this is a system which is prone to crisis. It's a system which is prone to war. It's a system which cannot look after the environment and will destroy the environment. It will do all of these things, and that is what is happening now again. And he also said that the people who produce the wealth, the working people in society, part of the wealth that they produce is taken from them in the form of profit. And the money that Hayward is getting from BP is the money, the profit, that was made from BP workers in this country, from the oil workers, from all of these people. Now, I've just found I've had 10 minutes, so I really haven't got to the point of what I wanted to say, so I'll have